Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about planning the basics of planning a mountaineering trip. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the levels of climbing and how you can use an understanding of the way we grade climbing routes to help you when you're picking a mountaineering trip that you want to do. Then I'll talk about how to get into more specific routes and what resources you can use to find those, and then just some other general things to consider when you finally kind of come maybe to the mountain you want to climb or the area you want to climb. What's going to help you pick that route that makes sense for you and the group that you are going to be climbing with. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is the different levels of climbing. This is a bit confusing, and if I say the wrong word here or there, what's going to really help you is just looking this up and kind of getting a general grasp on it, but I'm just going to do a quick overview here. So there's what we call the class, which is based on, in the United States, the Yosemite decimal system. So there's a class which ranges from class 1 to class 5 of climbing. Class 1 climbing is walking on flat ground. Class 2 climbing is when you starts to get a little steeper. Class 3 climbing is the first time that maybe you would need a rope, but most likely not. Class 3 is more like scrambling up a hill. Class 4 is the kind of in-between area where some people are going to need a rope to feel comfortable and safe, where others will feel like a rope isn't needed and it's actually safer not to have a rope for a variety of reasons. Finally, Class 5 is vertical terrain, where if you do not have a rope and you were to fall, it would lead to some sort of serious injury. Like, a rope is necessary for your safety. Once you get to Class 5, as you may know, it starts to get very specific. Everything from 5, we add a decimal point, 5.0, all the way up to 5.15 A, B, C, which is the hardest climbing in the world. And that isn't super applicable to the average mountaineering that you're going to experience, but there might be some technical rock climbing in the mountains, depending on where and what you're trying to climb. Now, obviously, there are mountains that are just massive rock climbs, but that isn't really considered necessarily mountaineering. It's more on the rock climbing, or what we like to call alpine climbing side of things. Okay, so that's the class-based system. Now you also have grades, and a grade is supposed to give you kind of a quick picture of a route, the overall experience you're going to have on a route. And grades range from 1 to 6. 1 being like just a rock climb, like a single pitch climb that you can do, in like under an hour, up to grade 6, which is going to be an overnight trip, meaning it's going to take you more than one day to climb the route. And you can put a grade like this on something like El Cap, which is a pure rock climb, or on climbing a volcano in the Cascades. Now, these grades are very subjective, and people definitely do class 6 climbs in a day, but they might not be doing it in the way that climb was originally done or intended for people to climb it. I mean, just the traditional way that you're going to climb it, the way that most people experience the route, it probably is going to take more than one day. So when you're doing your initial research, which we'll talk about more in a moment, you can look for these things, and they can give you a picture of what the climb is going to look like. So if you see something that says it's a grade 6 and the class is 513C and you've never rock climbed before, you might want to read about it and learn about it, but that might not be the best idea for your first climb. All right, so where are you going to look to find these? I mean, we all know a great resource today is the internet, and some websites that I recommend you look up and maybe write down right now are Summit Post and Mountain Project, and then I personally love, once I find a place to explore, to just look at it with Google Earth, or if I've already kind of decided on a more specific route, I'll often use a website like CalTopo or the app Gaia to kind of look more specifically at the elevation gain and the length of the route. But this information can be found in other places. So, and that it can also be found in route descriptions of websites. You don't necessarily have to recreate the wheel and map out the exact route yourself, but it is helpful for you to have an understanding, especially helpful to have an understanding of the bigger picture of the area that you're going to, because maybe something goes wrong and you have to change your plans. And having a better understanding, looking at maps, it gives you a more full picture of what you're going to experience. So the next thing, something that I love to look at and really enjoy are guidebooks. So I'm going to show you a couple. So here's an example of a guidebook. This guidebook talks specifically about volcanoes in the Cascades. Not a ton of those, but there are some, and they're great to climb. Examples, obviously, Mount Rainier or Mount Baker, Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, and there's some other more obscure ones in this book. This is kind of like, okay, that's the kind of mountaineering I want to do. A lot of those climbs are going to be very similar, so maybe you look at this book to get some ideas if you're thinking about climbing, in the snow, on a glacier, something like that. A book like this could be really helpful. Or you could look at something like this, which is a group of like the classic climbs, according to these authors, in the Cascades. And these range from pure rock climbs to ice climbs, and then more big mountain stuff. And they're gonna maybe have more routes or just a few routes for a mountain, whereas that last book might have every route on Mount Baker instead of just the 2 best routes, according to these authors. Now, the internet is a great resource, but sometimes there are books out there that are going to be more helpful in some situations. Say you're trying to climb like a less common route, something obscure in the Cascades. Now, the Cascade Alpine Guide by Fred Beckey is kind of the Bible when it comes to the Cascades of climbing. And there's actually 3 volumes, so it's a lot of books. 3 volumes for 3 different regions, but it has pretty much every mountain that anyone's ever really thought about climbing in those books. So maybe you can't find a trip report on Summit Post or Mountain Project, but you really want to climb the mountain that you could see, from your hometown growing up. Well, it's probably in those books. And I will just say that all this is a wealth of information. Be careful, because Fred Beckey, for example, the descent is often not listed. It just says, go down the right way you can, basically. So, sometimes you can get yourself into trouble by getting really excited about a climb, but maybe not having all the information that you need. And that's when, if you don't have the information and you can't find it out there, there might be a reason why people aren't climbing that particular mountain very often. Maybe it's just really hard to access, or maybe the difficulty of it is challenging in a way that people don't feel is worth the risk. Perhaps the rock quality isn't very high, or just the general nature of the climb isn't something that people are really interested in. That doesn't mean you can't climb it, but there's often clues as to why there's not a lot of information out there about a climb. All right, so we've done our research, and we are starting to bring together an idea of what type of thing or where we want to climb. So let's talk about how we decide on the actual climb itself. So the first thing you want to think about, I think, is the length of the climb. So, the reason that I think about this is because I have to base my trip, my overall plan on this. Do I have the time to spend multiple days on the mountain, or do I only have the time to spend one day? There are lots of climbs in the Cascades that are going to take the average person multiple days to complete. Maybe the approach to the climb is many miles of grueling bushwhacking, or maybe you park in the parking lot and put on your mountaineering boots. Mount Rainier, for example, although it is the highest peak in Washington State, the most common route has 0 approach. Most people are putting on their mountaineering boots in the parking lot, and some of them are starting in the snow, depending on what time of year you're going, of course. So the length of the climb is a big deal. There are really cool climbs that you can do in less than a day that are technical and even potentially involve snow travel or a glacier that you can do from your car to your car and be done in one day. And there's a lot of advantages to that. You don't necessarily have to carry as much gear. But one thing to think about is just because you think you can do something in a day doesn't mean you should. And it also, doing a trip in a day brings in a higher margin, well, a lower margin of error and potentially higher level of risk. Because if you don't have that overnight equipment and you get stranded in a mountain environment, especially in a snow-based environment, you don't have the ability to spend the night necessarily, and that could cause some problems. So that's just something to think about. Because there are lots of people who have done climbs in a day that, for a beginner or someone who's just thinking about, like, maybe depending on your group, these climbs are going to take a lot longer. So that's really important to think about, that just because the guidebook says this climb is going to take 5 hours, it doesn't mean it's going to take your group 5 hours. So that's why it's important to know the exact elevation gain and the exact mileage. And like, obviously that's going to change. That can change depending on the conditions, but that's going to give you a better picture than just, oh, this book says this takes 5 hours to accomplish. All right, so moving on from the length of the climb, let's talk about technicality. So the big thing about the technicality of climb is it's going to determine gear. If you are climbing a snow slope, is that snow on a glacier? Is it steep snow? Is there potential for ice to form on that snow? How long will you be traveling on the snow? How deep is the snow? What kind of snow? How firm is the snow? All these things are going to play into, those are all technical elements of a snow-based climb. Now, obviously, there's even more technical elements of mountaineering, ice climbing and vertical rock climbing being the two most common technical elements. And those, you're going to be able to pretty quickly figure those out. We talked about the class and the grade earlier. I didn't get into ice climbing, but if you see anything that says like AI3 or WI3 or any of those things, and perhaps oftentimes in guidebooks or on routes, it'll say like ice tools needed in the equipment that you need. And that's going to give you a quick picture that, oh, I have to be able to ice climb to climb this route. And if you don't have those skills, you're probably going to want to look for something else. So the big thing with technical gear, there's two things. It adds a lot of weight and it adds a lot of time. The more you're pulling out a rope and climbing vertical rock or ice, or perhaps even descending of those things, the longer you're going to take to cover less ground. So that's going to make a big difference in your overall time. And here's an example in the Cascades of something to think about. Mount Shuksan has a short technical rock climb at the top, but it's very seasonally dependent. That's the first thing to think about. In the spring, you might be able to walk all the way to the top of the mountain on snow, whereas as the summer progresses and the snow melts, you might need to be climbing 5-8 rock, traditional climbing, potentially in your mountaineering boots, if that's all you have, up to the top of the mountain. And the second thing to think about is there's other people out in the mountains, and they can add risk in technical situations, especially in the loose rock of the Cascades, if that's where you're climbing. Shuksan, I would personally not want to be directly below another climbing party ascending the summit pyramid on Mount Shuksan. So the more you learn about the specific route, you'll get to understand the technicality. But these are all things that you need to be factoring into the decision making when you decide what is right for the group and what is right for my trip. Okay, so snow conditions. We talked about how snow can add to the technicality. Well, how do you figure that out? Well, snow conditions unfortunately change year to year. They change a lot more than rock, because every year we have a different snowpack, obviously. So you can look at trip reports from the past, and you can try to figure out what the snowpack is for the year, what percentage we're at. And with the weather patterns that we have now, things change from year to year way more drastically than they have in the past, it seems. So that makes predicting the weather a lot more difficult. In the Cascades, we have variable weather, and so making sure you understand that snowpack when you're going on the trip is really important. So, for example, the snow conditions on a route might even make it unclimbable. Crevasses on glaciers are going to be filled in and covered up earlier in the season, and might in parts of the year that crevasse might be easy to navigate, whereas other parts of the year it might be impassable. The Coleman-Deming route on Mount Baker, which is one of the most common routes up to the summit of Mount Baker, has a large crevasse near the top of the route that in the last few years, due to lower snow conditions and quicker melting cycles, has opened up and caused the route to be impassable. There is no way around it that would be considered safe or wise or really just feasible. So that route, it basically closes down once that crevasse is open and all the snow bridges have melted out. If that were to become something that's super common, maybe someday you would see people using ladders. But due to the fact that Mount Baker has lots of other ways to get to the summit that are pretty similar, so far I haven't heard of anybody using a ladder to cross that crevasse. Whereas on Mount Rainier, there are traditional crevasses that open up every climbing season, and the commercial companies will actually install ladders just because it makes it so much more efficient for them to get their clients to the summit. So that's another aspect of snow conditions you need to think about. Are the crevasses open, or are they passable on snow bridges? And like by looking at pictures of a glacier, I really like to look at pictures that are late in the season. You can find them sometimes on Google Earth, and you can see, oh wow, like there are so many crevasses on the average glacier today. Not all glaciers are very complicated and they're not all the same, but those later in the season, those crevasses will really start to open up, and you can kind of understand the danger of traveling on a glacier. Okay, so now let's talk about rope teams, because rope teams, if we're traveling on snow and we know that there's no glacier, we're not worried about falling into a crevasse. So there are times when you might need a rope team when you are traveling on snow and there is not a glacier, and that would be due to potential steepness of the route, and that's probably about it. Steepness, there might be some moats, which aren't crevasses, but they're holes in the snow caused by melting of water, like along the edge of a route, potentially along the edge of a snowfield, up against like the side of a rock wall, something like that. You might just do it for the security and the practice if you are just not used to being high up, and it kind of keeps everybody together. So when you're a beginner, those are things to think about. But once you decide if you're going to have a rope team, it's really important to think about how you're going to manage the rope team and decide who goes with who. Like say we have a group of 6 people. You could have potentially 3 rope teams of 2, 2 rope teams of 3, a rope team of 4, a rope team of 2. And when we're traveling on a glacier, the most common rope team is going to be 3 to 4 people because of crevasse rescue, which I won't get into here, but I'll just tell you that it's really cool and something that you can learn a lot about, and it makes climbing on crevasses, once you know how to do that, a lot more exciting, because even though that's a dangerous thing you might experience, you probably will get to practice it, and you'll be more confident when you're on a glacier. But anyway, moving on. When you decide on a rope team, you usually, if you have a group of, let's say 6 people, and you've got 2 experienced people, you're going to want to put both of those experienced people on separate rope teams. And generally speaking, the most experienced person is going to be in the front, which when you're ascending, that's the literal front of the rope. But when you're descending, you might put them in the back of the rope team. And then you're going to evenly space those people out over the rope, and that gets more technical. But it's really important to think about, how big is my group? How am I going to split people up? You're not going to probably, with 6 people, put all 6 people on one rope. So you're going to need 2 ropes, which adds to the gear that you need for the experience. All right, so we've thought about how long our climb is. We've thought about how technical it is. We know what the snow conditions are like. We know who's going to climb with who. Well, let's say we're climbing in the Cascades. Biggest bummer out here is the weather when it comes to climbing, because sometimes it just doesn't cooperate. So I like to say, if you have the choice, go when there's a weather window. Give yourself some time so that you might have multiple days to attempt the summit, of the climb, or potentially you could do something else in the area. But generally speaking, the weather patterns are going to be pretty similar within, a few hours of each other in the Cascades. So you're not probably going to be able to drive somewhere else and climb something different. So it's really important to know what the weather's like. And sometimes, especially if you have a long drive to get to the climb, you might call the climb because of the weather conditions. Now, some websites that I really like to use, NOAA is great because you can pinpoint the specific mountain and see that 10-day forecast. But also, Mountain Forecast has pretty much every common mountain that's climbed, and it has a specific weather for the mountain based on elevation. So you can look at the elevation on the summit, the elevation about midway up the mountain, maybe that's where your base camp is going to be, and the elevation, the bottom of the mountain. So the weather at all three different kind of bands of elevation, and it has a lot of extra information on there, and it's really well packaged for a beginner to look at. There's some really advanced weather websites that you can look at, but for now I wouldn't recommend those because they can just be too much information. You kind of just want a general picture of what the weather is going to be like. On a glacier especially, visibility is really important because of crevasses. If you've never been somewhere and you're trying to climb a route, it's going to be really difficult on a glacier if you're in, say, a whiteout, if you don't have GPS technology. Now, I think that today, especially with the smartphone, being able to use GPS technology to climb on a glacier is really important, and I don't think you should necessarily plan on relying on it. First of all, you should always have a paper map, especially on a glacier, a topographical map, which can give you, will work even if your phone dies. But having a smartphone with an app like Gaia or a GPS, today I wouldn't recommend a specific GPS unit. I'd recommend getting Gaia and preloading the map into your phone and using that as a backup. But it's also really nice to have in whiteout conditions. But like I was trying to get to, we don't really want to climb on a glacier in whiteout conditions. You want to wake up early in that morning if you need to and look up and see those stars and have visibility all day. That's the ideal on a glacier. And obviously, if there's technical rock climbing, any moisture is going to make that really difficult. Climbing rock in the rain is really, really hard because you don't have any friction. So we want to avoid rainy days on those technical climbs. And if there's ice involved, it needs to stay cold so that the ice isn't melting. So there's a lot of factors when it comes to the weather, and that's going to all depend on the type of climb you're doing and how many days are you going to be out, and is the weather going to change? Do you have the ability to check the weather when you're out in the field, or are you just basing your decisions on a weather forecast that's 3 or 4 days old? Those are things to think about. All right, one of the last things, I guess the last thing on my list is permits, and it's probably not the last thing that you should think about. It's probably, once you've decided on your climb, it's one of the first things you should figure out. And this is going to come down to what kind of trip you're leading, and it's going to probably be very different if you're going on a personal mountaineering trip or on any type of commercial or even an educational-based mountaineering trip. So I'm going to give you some examples of some different situations where permits come into play. So on Mount Baker, there are different land management agencies. There's a national recreation area on Mount Baker, and there's also a national forest. And depending on what route you're climbing, you might be in both of those and you might not. In the national recreation area, you don't need a permit at all for even a commercial trip. In the national forest, you need a voluntary permit, you should fill out a voluntary permit if you're going on a private trip, and you would need a special use commercial permit if you are leading a commercial trip. And so that's going to depend on which route you do on the mountain. Now, sometimes you don't need a permit to climb a mountain, and this is the case maybe even with Mount Baker in some situations, but you do need a permit to spend the night in a specific area. So a really common place with some really cool climbing objectives on the more technical side, but there are some glaciers and snow routes you can climb, is the Enchantments, which is just outside of Leavenworth, Washington, or potentially, depending on which side you're coming from, the other side of the mountains, like Cleelum. So this range is a lottery-based system for overnight permits for the nicer months of the year. But a lot of the routes could potentially be done in one day. So that's where you have to make a decision. Is this the right choice for my group? Are we able to safely and efficiently climb this route in one day from our car back to our car, or do we need that permit? And then you're going to be thinking about applying for that permit many months in advance, which is going to complicate things because you need to decide that you're going to attempt this trip several months before when you're applying for that lottery. And if you don't get the permit, you now don't have a guarantee that you can go. Most lottery systems have a first come, first serve of at least like 30%, and that's the case in the Enchantment. So your group could show up at the ranger station the day before and try to get that permit, but if you're taking a commercial group, that's not really going to be a feasible option. So that's something to think about, a type of permit. Now, the most probably complicated thing would be like some sort of application, which technically the Enchantments, there's an application, but it's not like you really have to prove that you know what you're doing. But there are routes even in California, like routes on Mount Whitney, where you need to apply and say what your level of experience is before you're entered into that permit lottery. That would be the same if you were to try to climb some large-scale objective in, say, the Himalayas. And not only do you have to apply for those permits, you also have to pay for them. So there's more than just an application fee. There might be an application fee, and then also you have gotten the permit, and now you have to purchase that permit for an additional fee. So that's a big thing to think about when you're planning any of these trips. And there's not going to be a lot of information about commercial permits or educational-based trip permits on the internet. I would say the number one way to find this out is to talk to someone on the phone who is part of that land management agency for the specific route you want to climb on the mountain. But it's really important to understand that just because you call the phone number that says doesn't mean that person actually knows what they're talking about. I hate to break it to you. If you get someone whose job is to work the front desk, they're going to do their best to answer your questions, but you're going to want to talk to someone who specifically works with permits, wilderness permits or climbing permits. Sometimes you can talk to a climbing ranger if you're really lucky, or just someone who's very understanding and really knows what you're asking them. So that's really important to do. And if possible, stopping by a ranger station in person on your way to a trip is going to help you fully understand what you can and can't do and what you might need. So that's something to think about when you're planning a mountaineering trip. So that was a lot of information. I encourage you to look into some of those resources that I mentioned. And mountaineering is an incredible experience, and I highly recommend it. I think that there is a mountaineering trip out there for everyone, and mountaineering is something that you can pursue for your entire life, and it just covers such a broad variety of experiences. Although it can be very difficult, I found it to be extremely rewarding. All right, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something.